Well, for more on this, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Michael Shank. Michael Shank, Associate Director of Legislative Affairs at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. He's been following the issue closely. Michael Shank, I thank you greatly for taking time and joining us today.
Mitch, it's great to be with you. Thanks for covering this issue.
First, your reaction to today's hearing.
Was thrilled with the Senators Coburn and McCaskill, as you've mentioned, but also Senator Paul, Senator Johnson, and several other senators really grilling Defense Logistic Agency, which handles the 1033 program coming out of the Pentagon, as well as Department of Homeland Security for a couple egregious errors, them being very little oversight of this program, very little training of U.S. police, very little knowledge of U.S. police needs, very little needs assessment before giving this military equipment to U.S. police all across America, and some pretty awful stories.
One of the things I got from this hearing is that the local police agencies get this military equipment for free.
Right. So two ways that a U.S. police force can get military equipment. One is through the Pentagon, through the 1033 program, which is named so because in 1997, National Defense Authorization Act had a line item in it which says military equipment coming back from Iraq, Afghanistan, so that's tanks, Humvees, assault weapons, drones, grenade launchers, you name it, MRAPs, as we've already discussed, can be passed along to U.S. police forces, small and large, for free, provided that the local police force pays for the delivery and then pays for all maintenance. So a town might have to pay annually $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 to repair it, which we're seeing now. Or they can get it through the Department of Homeland Security's terrorism grants. $35 billion has been given in cash grants to U.S. police through that program, and then they use it to buy new equipment, war equipment if they want it. And through the 1033 program, $5 billion has been given from the DoD.
Now, another thing that I got out of this hearing today is that the equipment that the local police agencies are getting, this militarized equipment, is not to be used for riot suppression or for demonstrations. Yet I particularly can remember during the days of the Occupy movement being in Oakland and seeing one of these MRAP vehicles, which I guess officials will call it a truck, but it certainly looked like a tank. Has this equipment that's now at question been used for riot suppression and for demonstrations?
It's absolutely being used for riot suppression, whether in Ferguson, Oakland, or Seattle. Interesting that you mentioned Oakland, because when I was working in House of Representatives for Congressman Mike Honda, I saw pictures of the Oakland police responding to Occupy protests with armored personnel carriers, and that's what initially got me very interested in this militarization of U.S. police forces. So while there might be a legal caveat that says no use for riot oppression, they're absolutely being used for such.
So are they breaking the law then when local police do use these type of equipment?
I think the senators are going to drill down on this further in Government Affairs Committee, Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, as the hearing elucidated today, because there is a lot of ambiguity around this program, very little oversight, very little monitoring, and as a result, talk about breaking the law, the assault weapons that are coming to a lot of county sheriffs and police chiefs, they're actually selling on eBay, giving away to friends, and absolutely going outside the jurisdiction or the parameters provided to them by the 1032 program or the DHS program.
Putting it on eBay?
Yes, we've written about that extensively here at Friends Committee on National Legislation. Google it in USA Today, U.S. News, Reuters, The Guardian. We've documented, as have Associated Press, NPR, and others, the very loose trafficking of these weapons after they're given to U.S. police.
Now, talk to me more about this MRAP, which it seems like is all over the country now. And again, I think this is what we saw in Oakland during the Occupy Oakland protest. And I remember many of us just looking at it, wondering what in the world was. It looked like a tank. It was on wheels, but it certainly looked like a tank. But my understanding is this was originally used in Iraq to deal with unexplosive devices, IEDs.
Yep, Senator Tom Coburn asked this question today in the hearing. What's the difference between a militarized police and a military? And they really couldn't answer that question, because if you look at an MRAP, and it's in the definition of the acronym, Mine Resistant Ambush Protected Vehicle. So they are built for the war zone to prevent IED impact. And so you can see, if you translate it to a U.S. environment, very little use there. And perhaps more importantly, particularly in police areas where you have a majority white police patrolling or controlling minority community, which 3/4 of U.S. cities, 50,000 or more, you see that dynamic, that ratio. You set up a very antagonistic relationship with the community, and so community-oriented policing under the DOJ is kind of out the window because you've militarized the street.
Now, there are some, especially from law enforcement, that will say these MRAPs have been used successfully in gunfights and protecting officers, also helping getting officers out of a dangerous situation. There were many people who testified at today's hearing at the Senate Homeland Security Committee on the militarization of the police. I do want to play this clip from Jim Bowerman. Jim Bowerman is the president of the Police Foundation, and while he did say there needs to be oversight of this equipment, he also wanted to stress that how it's used, in his opinion, isn't always so negative.
The police use of military-like equipment and tactics can either be appropriate or not, depending entirely on the context of their use. The antidote to militarizing our police is community policing, transparency, accountability, and paying close attention to the culture of policing. While the committee reviews these programs, I urge you to consider their benefits along with needed programmatic changes. There has been substantial positive impact on the public and officer safety from the programs that provide equipment to law enforcement. For example, 2 weeks ago in Illinois, the Cook County Sheriff's Department used armored vehicles to get officers to the scene and extract 6 children and 2 adults being held hostage after a home invasion robbery. 2 officers were shot during the 20-hour standoff, but the equipment prevented further injury to officers and helped the safe recovery of the hostages. In West Bloomfield, Michigan, a suspect barricaded himself in a residential neighborhood, engaged in a firefight with the police, and killed a police officer. During the standoff, the police used their armored vehicle to safely evacuate the neighborhood. And finally, this summer, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department used rescue helicopters obtained through the 1033 program 11 times during search and rescue missions in mountainous terrain. They also used boats obtained through the program 6 times for rescue missions on Lake Mead.
Again, that's Jim Bowerman. He is the president of the Police Foundation, testifying at today's Senate Homeland Security Committee hearing on the militarization of police forces. Joining us on the telephone from Washington, D.C. is Michael Shank. He is Associate Director of Legislative Affairs at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. He follows the issue quite closely. Michael Shank, how would you respond to what you heard from Jim Bowerman there?
I would argue that police are increasingly, and you're seeing this with the SWATification of raids. Radley Balco writes about this, seeing 150 SWAT raids a day to perform basic search warrants. But the police are actually escalating the situation. So while that military equipment might prevent them from further shelling after they've already escalated, if you want to de-escalate a situation, an MRAP's not going to help with that. In fact, community intel and community integration, community representation within the police force is going to be a lot more effective. So I would argue that they've already escalated the situation. While it might prevent from shelling, it's doing very little to de-escalate any kind of riot situation or military situation.
Well, some new data from researchers at UC Berkeley indicate that when police show up in fully militarized gear, that it is more likely to escalate the situation.
That's right. That's exactly right. Which is why Congressman Johnson, we've been working with his office, Democrat from Georgia, Congressman Labrador, Republican, are coming together to introduce a bill this month that would prohibit all the military gear from the war zone coming to U.S. police through the 1033 program. It would allow other equipment like office equipment, microwaves, etc., to transfer, because let's make use of that, let's recycle that. But in terms of military equipment, it would prohibit the transfer. We'll likely see a Senate companion bill as well.
You mentioned Radley Balco. We're going to be speaking to him in a few minutes about the history behind all of this, beginning with the first SWAT team in Los Angeles during 1960s, 1970s. But Michael Shank, the significance of the hearing happening today, do you think anything is going to come from this? Because if I recall correctly from my readings, Harry Reid, who is the Democratic leader in the Senate, has indicated that he doesn't see a problem with these programs.
We're seeing building momentum. Increasingly, police chiefs like former Seattle Police Chief Norm Stamper is coming out. We had him on a hearing on the House side speaking against militarization of police. You see the momentum.
But Norm Stamper has been speaking out for a long time.
He has. It's
not surprising that we had him on the show a few weeks ago as well. Not surprising he has.
Here's the telltale sign, and the bellwether is Republican support. We're seeing bipartisan support in the House, bipartisan support in the Senate. We've been writing on this since last year, where it was quiet in Congress. A year later, we're seeing hearings on both sides. I'm very hopeful the momentum post-Ferguson, for very unfortunate reasons, will be the tipping point, I think.
Now, these programs are being portrayed. Here is equipment that the military isn't used or is now done with and now giving to local police agencies. One line of questioning by Claire McCaskill that was interesting is she was trying to figure out if things that were just recently bought are being shipped to police agencies.
That's right. Over 30% transfer through the 1033 program is new, so it's not just old equipment. And by old, it's 6 or 7 years old, so it's not old, it's still functioning. And you see in the pictures of transfers to police, keep in mind that towns of 25,000 or less are getting these MRAPs too. Dundee, Michigan, a town of 4,000 is getting MRAPs. So you're seeing MRAPs in very, very small towns that don't have a need for this kind of stuff, not like the Boston and New York references that came up in the hearing today. But yeah, a lot of the equipment is new. Now, the DHS Terrorism Grants Program has some defense industry profit interests because all that equipment is entirely new. Cash grants go to U.S. police. They buy the new equipment. Defense industry helping local law enforcement sign up for that equipment. But the 1033 program looks like 2/3 is old, and by old, 6 or 7 years, 1/3 is new.
And again, something that came up in today's hearing, which was interesting. We're actually, once we say goodbye to you, Michael Shank, we're going to play the entire back and forth between Obama administration officials and Republican Senator Rand Paul. But something that came up is when senators asked Obama administration officials, how often has this equipment been used for terrorist type of activities or counter-terrorism, and they can only come up with 2 incidents, Boston and New York City.
Correct, and New York wasn't even a great example either because it wasn't the heavily militarized gear that was used, the MRAPs, the armored personnel carriers, etc. in New York. They actually, under the 1033 program, have to use the equipment within the year, even though there's been no needs assessment based on actual need within the U.S. police force. So you're seeing units now use the gear because they have to, as required by the 1033. So we're going to see it used more and more post-first.
They're required to use it.
Correct.
Or they lose it?
Well, they're supposed to turn it back, but again, there's been no monitoring oversight. New York State was assigning this work to an intern to do oversight of the 1033 program. I think post-Senate hearing, you're going to see a lot more oversight, a lot more monitoring of this equipment. But as DHS and Defense Logistics Agency reps acknowledge, they've not been doing any oversight once it's passed on to U.S. police.
Do you think that you can get anything meaningful out of the Senate? And then, of course, getting out of the Senate requires getting it out of the House. I know earlier you indicated that you're hopeful because you see a bipartisan approach here. Most of the Republicans on this panel were very critical of the Obama administration officials. Of course, there could also be politics involved in there. But what would meaningful change be, and how likely is it that you'll get it?
I'm hopeful because this touches on the basics of American culture and American way of life. Like, people don't want their main streets to look like a war zone, and so you're seeing everything from libertarian to progressive Democrat interest, and I think it will become easier and easier for moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans in the Senate and the House to get on board. But once we see introduction in September, though immigration and Iraq will certainly get in the way of this legislation moving forward initially, I think we're going to see some actual change in both houses.
Michael Shank has been our guest. Again, he is Associate Director of Legislative Affairs at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. He has joined us to talk about today's Senate Homeland Security Committee hearing on the militarization of police forces. Michael Shank, I thank you greatly for taking time and joining us today.
Mitch, thanks for having me.
We do want to turn more